Welcome to Indus Special. I am Ejaz Haider. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has strongly rejected U.S. calls for his country to protect Kurdish fighters in Syria. Erdogan was referring to a statement made by U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton at the weekend and called it, I quote, unacceptable, unquote. Mr. Bolton was in Ankara to seek guarantees that a Kurdish militia battling the Islamic State group would be safe after U.S. troops pulled out. Turkey regards the People's Protection Units, the YPG, as a terrorist group. Mr. Erdogan told members of parliament from his governing Justice and Development Party on Tuesday that he could not accept and swallow Mr. Bolton's message. And he also said if the US evaluates them as Kurdish brothers, then they are in a serious delusion. He considers the YPG an extension of the banned Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which has fought for Kurdish autonomy in Turkey for 3 decades. The YPG says it has no direct organizational links to the PKK. Erdogan also refused to meet with Bolton. The saber rattling has come just days after Erdogan wrote an op-ed in the New York Times which began thus: President Trump made the right call to withdraw from Syria. The United States withdrawal, however, must be planned carefully and performed in cooperation with the right partners to protect the interests of the United States, the international community, and the Syrian people. Turkey, which is NATO's second largest standing army, is the only country with the power and commitment to perform that task, unquote. In the op-ed, Erdogan consistently stressed Turkey's primary role both in fighting and in subsequent peacekeeping and enforcement. Turkey also seems to be placing itself as a bridge between the US and Russia's approaches in Syria. It is interesting that Erdogan's op-ed has no mention of Bashar al-Assad's future or Tehran's interests in Syria. To discuss the situation, we have with us Dr. Tarek Cherkoi, who is a political analyst based in Istanbul, and Mohammad Marandi, who is a political analyst based in Tehran. Let me kick off with Dr. Cherkoi. Dr. Cherkoi, one gets a sense, especially after reading the op-ed that I referred to, that President Erdogan is looking at a primary role for Turkey, not just in relation to what happens subsequently on the ground, but also in terms of any possible transitional government or any further movement towards some kind of resolution of the crisis. And he also believes, as he said in the op-ed, that he's a bridge of sorts between Moscow and Washington. Is this sense correct?
Yes, indeed. I think we are now facing a very important development in Syria. And unfortunately, I'm sure the viewers in Pakistan can relate to that. The United States is used to creating big problems and then run away, creating even a bigger mess. And this is what we are facing right now, right here in this region, is the United States wants to wrap up its presence and quit, but there is definitely a very bad plan or even no plan in that sense. So there are lots of worries, there are lots of concerns. The United States have been acting somewhat in contrast with what it was preaching. They are in connivance with a band of terrorist groups in Syria. They pretext initially that this dealing with these terrorist groups was just temporary and was just to fight Daesh, but we have seen that they have been deploying.
What exactly are the terrorist groups you're talking about, Dr. Cherkoi, if you could possibly explain that?
So basically, I'm referring to the PYD. The PYD is is directly connected with the PKK. The PKK is an organization that has been brandished as a terrorist group by the UN, by the United States, by the European Union. So everybody agrees that this group is using violence to advocate political means, which is the definition of terrorism.
Okay, so you're saying that while the US has the YPG branded as a terrorist organization, it nonetheless worked with the YPG on the ground in Syria.
Yes, not only working on the ground, but boosting exponentially the means at the disposal of this group, giving them about like 2,000 containers of weaponry, of military hardware, which is very sophisticated and has boosted the capabilities of this terrorist group. So this has been a concern for quite some time, but now we are seeing that they want to basically make this fait accompli as a way of policy which is not acceptable to Turkey.
Okay, let me take you back to 2011, and I refer to 2011 because one of the things that you've said in your exposition is that the U.S. Creates problems and then, of course, just drops everything like a hot potato and gets out, creating even bigger problems. But some people would say, and this has been said very often, that it was Turkey that was also primarily instrumental in putting pressure on Bashar al-Assad for having, elections and for listening to the opposition there, and that was something. And it was also in collaboration with some of the opposition groups on the ground. This despite the fact that President Erdogan and his family and Bashar al-Assad and his family were very close at one time. Isn't that sense correct?
Well, I'm glad that you are bringing the historical perspective into this, because if you recall very well, the beginning of the problem was that Bashar al-Assad refused to listen to the demands of the people and started dealing with the very peaceful demonstration with very heavy-handed means, and using a lot of violence against indiscriminate violence against peaceful protesters, killing thousands, hundreds in the beginning, and then thousands, and then using the army to crush civilian population. So yes, of course, there can be some dealings, economics, on the economic level or on the social level. But when it reached that level where the regime in place starts genociding against its own population, then everything else becomes redundant at this stage. So Turkey has not been the cause behind the uprising in Syria. Turkey has just been actually the recipient. It's very much like what happened with Pakistan when you had received millions of Afghan refugees and you had to deal with that situation. Turkey is in the same position. There is a big conflict nearby, next door, and there were millions of people that were forced out of their homes, and they came to seek shelter in. This is why Turkey is a major player in this conflict, because it's concerned with this conflict. I again and again reiterate the parallels with Pakistan and Afghanistan, because I'm sure that your viewers will relate to that.
Absolutely. I will pull in Marandi on this, but since you gave the analogy of Afghan refugees and the conflict in Afghanistan, there are lots of quarters that also accuse Pakistan, rightly or wrongly, of having supported certain groups. And it's the same with Turkey, where even the US analysts and other Western analysts have been talking about Turkey's looking the other way as far as the IS cadres were concerned. I will come back to you on this, but let me, as I said, pull in Mohammad Marandi on this. Mr. Marandi, you heard Dr. Cherokee talk about Turkey's role, and he also agreed with me that given the op-ed and also what's happening on the ground, and in terms of his placing, clearly President Erdogan wants Turkey to play a primary role. Would you agree with that? And do you think Iran would be happy with Turkey playing that role?
Well, I think the mood in Tehran is to a large degree that the United States, its presence in the region has always had a very harmful, has always had very harmful consequences to ordinary people. And that the primary aim of the United States is to establish its own hegemony, or to keep its own hegemony over the region, but also it's always keeping in mind the interests of the Israeli regime. And therefore, its presence in Syria at the moment, which is illegal, is largely to keep Syria unstable, but also with an eye on Turkey, because the United States knows that these forces, these Kurdish forces, are antagonistic towards the Turkish government. And the belief in Tehran is that the United States wants to keep all the countries in the region weak. The same is true with the whole Syrian situation. The Iranians believe that the Syrian government was heavy-handed, but not, let's say, the Egyptian government during the coup, but no one, sent weapons in to undermine the state, or the Saudi government, which is infinitely more violent when it comes to Yemen, and it has tried to impose starvation on the country for years, but no one has, until recently, spoken up against the Saudi regime. If the United States had not led a military insurgency in Syria, we would not have had all these deaths in the countries and millions of people going to neighboring countries. So once you have that sort of interference, U.S.-led interference, which unfortunately countries in the region were a part of, then the country rapidly went downhill. And that's, of course, in the interest of Israel, because the Israeli regime wants a weak Syria, wants a broken Syria, wants a weak Jordan, a broken Jordan, a weak and broken Lebanon and Egypt. That's the prime objective of the Israeli regime. And therefore, the United States, while pursuing its own interests, it also pursues the Israeli interests, which are not always the same. And I personally believe that the United States does not have an interest in its illegal occupation of Egypt, but it is doing it basically for the sake of Israel.
Okay, so this is very interesting because clearly, at least there are two issues on which Tehran and Ankara are likely to have a convergence point. One is, of course, the Kurdish question, which is also an Iranian problem, not as severe as the one that faced by Turkey, but it is there. And the other has to do with the US presence in the region. So am I correct in assuming that these two convergence points are enough for Tehran and Turkey to get down to actually figuring out what kind of political dispensation or transitional government is possible post-conflict in Syria?
Well, I think that from the Iranian perspective, it's the state in Syria is the legitimate state, and it's not for Iran or other foreign powers to determine the future of Syria. Just like when the coup in Turkey was unfolding, and it was clear that the United States, the Saudis, the Emiratis were supporting the coup, the Iranians were absolutely against it because the Turkish government was the legitimate government and the government chosen by the Turkish people. In the case of Syria, Iran believes that foreign intervention is not legitimate and that the Syrians have to make their own decisions. But when it comes to Iran and Turkey, I think the points of convergence, the ones that you mentioned, are absolutely correct, but I think there are many more than that. Not only do the Iranians and the Kurds have, the Turks have interests in these areas, but also when it comes to the economy, when it comes to sovereignty and independence and American hegemony, when it comes to the rights of the Palestinian people, bilateral trade. And also Iran and Turkey, I think, are two countries in West Asia that culturally speaking have a much more that have strong similarities. I've traveled to Turkey quite often. My Turkish friend, I'm an Iranian Azeri by Marand is an Azeri city. Iran and Turkey have very strong cultural similarities, religiously speaking. They're both of moderate culture. They're very unlike Saudi Wahhabi Islam. And therefore, I think cultural, political, economic interests of Iran and Turkey are very significant. And when Iran and Turkey were in conflict over Syria, I think the fact that the two countries had so many interests, common interests, that was the reason why there was never a breakup in relations between the two countries over Syria, because the attachment between the two countries and the importance that the two countries recognize for one another is far greater than any other issue that could be used as a wedge to separate them.
Okay. Dr. Shakoi, Mohammad Marandi is essentially saying that as far as the presence of Bashar al-Assad is concerned, pre-conflict and also perhaps post-conflict. His point of view, which is obviously also the point of view of and the policy of the state of Islamic Republic of Iran, is that Bashar al-Assad was elected by the people of Syria. Now, there is a huge question mark on what kind of elections are seen in some of the states, Syria included. So in terms of the issue of legitimacy, there is a problem when we refer to the election of Bashar al-Assad, or for instance, Kim Jong-un, or any of the many such elections. Or there used to also be elections in the former Soviet Union. On the other hand, there is also a huge problem with the concept of intervention on the basis of R2P, because that means that the internal and the idea, the fundamental idea of the sovereignty of a country is challenged. So it is difficult, even at the best of times, to square these two concepts. What exactly would Turkey's policy be, considering that Turkey is sort of positioning itself to be the primary player post US troops withdrawal? What would Turkey's policy be with reference to the future of Bashar al-Assad?
Well, basically, I think that you have a situation here. I mean, we have a lot of the foreign policy of Turkey is based on a lot of legitimate principles, and one of them is the fight against terrorism. I don't like this kind of assumptions that Turkey has like given leeway or has somewhat condoned the presence of militant groups or people that are prone in terrorism. This is not true. Actually, Turkey has been. There was this story about one of the police officers who intercepted some trucks, but that entire thing was hushed up, and the man was removed from his position. So there are indications that some elements might have supported some of the groups fighting in Syria. Well, I think that the example that you are bringing has more layers into it. Actually, I'm not sure if you are following closely the news, but if you do, there was the coup d'etat that happened against the legitimacy here in Turkey was driven by some forces which were very hidden in the background, and they used all kind of destabilization, all kind of rumors.
So you're saying that the police officer who did this was also part of the Gulenist gang?
What I'm saying, if you take notice at the pattern, and for example, the killing of the ambassador, the Russian ambassador, this kind of dynamics were done by people you were in uniform and they belong to the Gulenist terrorist group. So, I mean, let us go beyond the small details which are meant by these forces to destabilize the legitimate government. Mm-hmm. And what we have really now is an opportunity. There is a threat and there is an opportunity. I agree with your guest that there are a lot of points of convergence between Iran and Turkey. Both countries are trying to wrap up this situation with the help of Russia and other players, the European Union included, to find some kind of solution to a long-lasting solution and stability to the region. These are the points of convergence. There are also points of divergence. Among the points of convergence, I would say also the fight against terrorism and Daesh, and also against these splinter groups, these kind of terrorist groups using Kurdish identity just as a masquerade to mask their real intentions, which is further destabilization for the region, which is not only a threat to Turkey, but it's also a threat to Iran if they don't take the situation under consideration.
Let me go back to the specific question that I asked, which is with reference to the future of Bashar al-Assad.
Well, as you have probably seen in the news, there have been so many meetings. Turkey is involved with with Iran, with Russia, with other entities into discussing the future that will be a more united Syria and trying to bring everybody on board. There have been many processes into that, and I think it's going steadily. There have been some hiccups, but negotiations are ongoing. The future, I can't tell you for sure. I'm sure that right now these discussions are still taking place, but they will be at least the hope for everybody, for hope for the refugees, hope for the people who have been displaced, whether internally or externally, that they will have a united Syria, a Syria that will probably cater for all its citizens.
Okay, so we are not really sure about that, but I'm also joined by Adam Ben Said, also an analyst based in Istanbul. So let me just take this question to him. We were talking about, among other things, the future of Bashar al-Assad. Since I have one of my panelists sitting in Tehran, the other in Istanbul, it seems to me that there are increasingly some convergence points between Turkey and Iran. But the future of Bashar al-Assad, of course, is a sticking point, although even the Russians are not particularly interested in having him there if a resolution demands some kind of different dispensation. What exactly are your thoughts on the issue of Bashar al-Assad's future?
Thank you for having me. Bashar al-Assad has established time and time again that he has a callous disregard for human lives and for international relations and the international system in general. So I think before saying anything, we have to establish that any transitional future has to take into account the future of the Syrian people, their humanitarian conditions, and all the rest of that. And the chief stakeholders in this should be countries that have aided, assisted, and done their best to ensure stability and peace in the region and assisted the humanitarian crisis in the region specifically. And I can name Turkey in this regard. For me personally, for other countries that have played a proxy role in fomenting conflict and crisis and warfare in the region should not have a seat at the table in deciding what happens next. Recently, we see the...
So you are opposed to Turkey playing the primary role. We were obviously discussing President Erdogan's pushback against what Bolton said. And I was also referring to his New York Times op-ed of Jan 7, in which he is clearly trying to position Turkey as the primary player and also the bridge between Moscow and Washington.
I believe you misunderstood me, sir. Turkey is the best situated to play a role in this, given the amount of refugees it's taken in, given the amount of effort it's taken part in the international coalition against ISIS, and in ensuring stability in northern Syria. For other countries that have played proxy roles in fomenting conflict, these less so. And by these,
so you're saying that Turkey is not one of those countries that has played a proxy role?
Absolutely not.
Okay. So how exactly do you think Turkey should be playing? So there are other stakeholders. There is Iran. Presumably, you're saying that Iran has played a proxy role. There's Saudi Arabia. There are other regional countries directly or indirectly involved in some way or the other as part of the US led coalition, and also as part of the Moscow-led effort. So you're singling out Turkey as the only honest broker that can play a role, not anyone else.
Again, I think you're taking my words out of context. I didn't use the word honest broker or the only at all. What I am saying, however, is that Turkey has played a significant role and therefore should be a key decision maker. Obviously, let's be realistic. Nothing can happen without consensus and proper decision making between the world powers who are involved as stakeholders. However, I question the utility of having someone on the table deciding what happens, having supported Assad with chemical weapons, having supported, let's say, YPG terrorists with incursions against Turkey, and having supported the wholesale slaughter of Syrian civilians. It doesn't make for an equitable outcome for Syrian civilians here, and I think that should be the priority. What happens to the Syrians who have been dispossessed by the war in the future? What happens to their livelihoods? What happens to reconstruction? Shall we continue as if nothing has happened, or will things be better?
Okay, in order for me not to misunderstand your words again, Could you possibly give me a sense of what states should exactly be involved in any further negotiations or resolution or some kind of transitional government post-conflict?
I think time will tell, especially with the prospective U.S. withdrawal from Syria. That looks like it's going to change the cards on the table significantly. Obviously, Israel would like to play a part, and they're trying to do this clearly with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, with the most recent Mossad meeting on the side for rehabilitating Bashar al-Assad's image in the Arab League and reintegrating him into the system. Iran and Russia obviously have a vested interest, whether for energy or foreign policy, against the GCC. But this is what I am saying. We have to be clear about the motives and the agendas. And in spite of divergences and convergences, the picture overall does not look healthy in the entirety. We have to take into consideration what are the prime motives. A country ensuring stability for its southern border is altogether different from a country that is waging proxy warfare against countries in the region, or countries that are simply seeking access to the Black Sea for naval force projection, if you see what I mean here.
Yes, I do, but here's the problem. So if we count out Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, we still have the UN Security Council with the five powers, rightly or wrongly, where you have the United States, which is withdrawing troops, but is not withdrawing its interests in the region. And Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Israeli interests can always be reflected in and through the US interests and US negotiations and US's presence in terms of figuring out a future configuration for Syria.
Of course, of course. And nowhere is this better reflected than in the words of John Bolton recently in his visit to Ankara, where he tried to renege on a deal that Donald Trump had made for the U.S. withdrawal from Syria, making it a precondition to protect YPG terrorists, in spite of the fact that the deal was essentially to rid the region, rid northern Syria from terrorism. Now, John Bolton himself is a neoconservative war hawk who has decidedly anti-Iranian stances, along with Pompeo. He has spoken out against the United Nations and explicitly asked to leave it if necessity demands it. These are not the actions of statesmen. And to further complicate things, the U.S. administration's stance, even if we can count on them to support the Israeli position, is convoluted and complicated and even conflicting from within. The stances from the White House do not reflect the State Department or the foreign policy establishment. So I think it's a bit premature to say who should be on the table, as you're asking. But we should bear in mind that some countries have earned the right to determine through their track record towards the Syrian people, and this is the benchmark by which we should be assessing the situation. Some countries have earned the right and others have not.
Okay, and one of the states that has burned the right to be on the table, would that be Iran, in your view, or you think you are likely to give Iran a pass on this?
No, I think we should be realists about the situation. Ultimately, there is no, it's not a zero-sum game. We should be realists about the fact that Iran does have divergences with Turkey and with other countries in the region, and that where we can maximize the utility of these divergences to ensure peace and stability in the region, we should take these opportunities, obviously.
Okay, Adam, so I'm happy you talked about realism, because as a structural realist myself, I believe that one has to look at what the situation on the ground is and what the possibilities are. And at the end of this conversation, we have returned to the very states that have been fighting a proxy war in Syria, because at the end of the day, they're all going to be at the table. But thank you so much for your views on this. And for a final word, I go back to Mohammad Marandi. You heard what has been said. One of the things that Iran clearly wants is the U.S. departure. But as far as the U.S. troops' departure is concerned, that does not necessarily mean the departure of U.S. interests from the region.
Yes, I think that is true, and but at the same time, I think the belief in Tehran is that there is a gradual decline of relative strength being projected by the United States in general, and that there is a general shift of power in the globe, and especially with internal dynamics that we currently see in the United States, I think that belief is reinforced. Having said that, however, I think that the United States has no intention of allowing this region to thrive. The belief in Tehran and Baghdad and Damascus and Beirut, among other places, is that this whole catastrophe in Syria was the result of the policies of the U.S. government, especially under Obama, for supporting extremists in Syria. We know that through the Defense Intelligence Agency documents of 2012 that was partially released. We know that from General Michael Flynn's interview on Al Jazeera English, where he admitted that the United States, during the early days, took a willful decision to support the extremists. We know that Biden at Harvard admitted that neighboring countries supported the extremists in Syria. Of course, he fails to note that the central role that the United States played. And I don't think that under Trump, the United States is going to change, because we've seen that both under Obama and Trump, the United States supported Saudi aggression in Yemen. But under Trump, we see that even though his opponents have suddenly shifted and changed their mind about Yemen, he continues to adamantly support the Saudis. And of course, as I said, the belief in Tehran is widely that the United States' central concern is Israel, even though the interests of the Israeli regime do not coincide, in my opinion, with that of the United States, but their interests are often prioritized over the interests of the American people.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Tariq Cherkoi, Adam Ben Sayed, and Mohammad Marandi. We'll take a short break, and on the other side of the break, we'll discuss Kim Jong-un's Beijing visit and what it means for the US, China, North Korea triangle. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We move on to the North Korean strongman Kim Jong-un's Beijing visit. Since the announcement of the Singapore summit on March 8th of last year, Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping have met 4 times. What's China's play? There was speculation that China might use the occasion of Kim's visit as leverage in managing US-China trade talks. That was the deal, according to Trump, when he met Xi at Mar-a-Lago. But that understanding was discarded, and Trump escalated tariff pressure on China last year. It is unlikely that Xi will have much reason that Trump would honor a renewed linkage between North Korea and the US-China trade issue. China does want North Korea as a buffer between it and South Korea, where the US has thousands of troops stationed. Equally, Xi doesn't want a Kim running amok. What does Kim Jong-un want from China? Does he want to enhance his own strategic depth and standing, and thinks the most effective way to do so is to cuddle up to China? Be that as it may, there is a flip side. It also shows Kim's vulnerability and dependency on China. From the US perspective, closer Sino-North Korea ties also enhance US mistrust of China as a potential manipulator of US-North Korean mutual hostility. Trump has himself expressed concern that China might play the role of spoiler in US-North Korea negotiations. So, can Kim take China for granted, thinking that China is weighed down by the geopolitical imperative of maintaining North Korea as a stable buffer? Is Kim aware of the opposite side of this equation, the need to be close to China to secure the leverage necessary to negotiate improved relations with other actors on more favorable terms than otherwise attainable, a vulnerability that gives much room to Beijing to exercise its own leverage on Pyongyang? To discuss this, we have with us Omer, who's an analyst based in Istanbul, and we'll also have Malik Ayub Simbal, who's a political analyst based in Beijing. Omer, how do you see this fourth visit within less than a year? And of course, a birthday gift also. But more than the birthday gift, what's the substance of this?
Hi, thank you for having me today. First of all, I would like to say that, as you said, this is the fourth visit. Kim Jong-un is expected to meet Trump soon. So yes. Kim Jong-un is not feeling confident about his second summit with Donald Trump. So he's trying to be seen in solidarity with Chinese counterpart. And this sends a message to the US that even if the US does not cooperate, and even if they keep the economic sanctions, North Korea can still do well with Chinese support. And secondly, Kim's meetings Kim's meetings with Xi Jinping are an effort to drive up the price. This is a bargaining table. So the Kim Jong-un is trying to drive up the price with the United States beyond what North Korea would be able to demand on its own. And also, as you mentioned, the frequency of the meetings, like this is the fourth visit. So it seems that these meetings are driven more by Kim's vulnerability than his strength. So as a young leader dealing with the United States, Kim might be getting advices. Actually, he needs a country like China to offer advice. So after all, China has been dealing with the United States all the time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's the thing. Kim, on Xi Jinping's watch, carried out the nuclear tests and the missile tests, including the ICBM test. And China kind of looked the other way. So it does not seem that Kim is entirely beholden to China. I agree with you, as I also said in my introduction, that yes, Kim wants to snuggle up to China because that kind of gives him an added leverage in his negotiations with the United States. But Kim, to me, also seems like an independent actor when it comes to doing certain things.
Yeah, you are right. They are trying to find. North Korea is trying to give this impression that they are independent. Mm-hmm. So they are having these meetings with all countries in the region, like China, South Korea, and the U.S. But at the same time, as I said before, the frequency of these meetings with China more than other countries, this shows that Kim Jong-un is vulnerable. No matter how he tries to show that he is not dependent on China, but like we understand from all these visits that he might be getting some advices, or he's trying to he's trying to increase his bargaining power. So yes, these are the impressions that we get from these meetings.
Okay, before we go back to Kim, tell me, what's your sense of what China's play is here?
Yeah, these meetings are important for China too, more important than before, because as you know, there has been a trade war going on between China and the United States for the last 9 months almost.
Yeah.
And because of this trade war, Chinese economy has started to slow down sharply. So Xi Jinping might be trying to remind Trump that China has a closer tie with North Korea and can play a key role in relationships between North Korea and the U.S. Also, against the trade war declaration of the U.S., it is useful for China to have a friend like North Korea when dealing with the United States.
Okay, so as I said, there was a certain kind of understanding at Mar-a-Lago when Trump and Xi Jinping met, but the U.S. disregarded that and discarded it. Now, for Beijing to think that they can somehow have a deal on U.S.-China trade by getting Kim to deliver something, what would be the deliverable? Because if we go back to the Singapore meeting and the 4-point understanding, it was very clear that the U.S. thought that they are talking about complete denuclearization of North Korea, whereas North Korea was looking at it in terms of the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, which includes the extended nuclear deterrence that the South Koreans have from the U.S. So what exactly are the deliverables? I mean, what can Xi Jinping do to get Kim to deliver to the U.S. that would then help Beijing do some kind of favorable deal on the U.S.-China trade issue?
Yes, as you said, Trump and Kim, they met in Singapore and they made a deal. But the deal, after they left Singapore, they could not achieve anything because there is this huge mistrust accumulated during the entire years. So each side are waiting for a step from the other side. The US is waiting for North Korea to denuclearize, to lift the sanctions. And North Korea is waiting for the US to lift sanctions, and then he will try to denuclearize the peninsula.
But you really think that North Korea will at some point be ready to denuclearize after having crossed the threshold?
That is the question, actually. China enters the play at this question because China can just break this mistrust among the countries between the US and North Korea, and China need a bargaining power too. So, and has a closer relationship with North Korea, so it can persuade North Korea to somehow come to table with something tangible, and then can talk back to the US and say, here is North Korea. He is ready to denuclearize, but you need to give something back. And then China might benefit from this deal too. Might benefit, it's going to benefit from this deal.
Okay, Omer, stay with me. I also have Malik Ayub from Beijing with us. Mr. Sumbul, what is Kim Jong-un doing in Beijing? I mean, what's his play? And also, what's China's play?
Thank you very much, Ejaz, for having me in this program. Actually, this visit is not a surprise visit. It was, I think, a pre-planned, because when Kim Jong-un just moved from the DPRK in his train, so the Chinese media and all newspaper and the TV channels have the news about this, that the Kim is coming here into Beijing, because prior meetings with Donald Trump, he must have to take some advices and something like the tips of the diplomacy and how to move forward with this Kim and Trump second split that's going to be happen soon.
Okay, so Kim wants to get, according to you, Kim wants to get China's advice before he goes into a second summit with Trump. But what does China want?
Of course, it means that all this, Donald Trump also mentioned repeatedly that this first Kim Jong-un and Trump, the meeting that was actually held with the cooperation of the Beijing and very strong efforts made by the Beijing. Otherwise, it was not possible. So I think that this visit, in this visit, he will definitely take some of the future measures and how this process will be further go on, and what will be the future repercussions, what will be the future forecast, and how Kim should have to be act into the international arena in this Korean Peninsula episode.
Let me go back to Omer on this. So Kim wants advice from China. China somehow wants to signal to the US that it has leverage with Kim, but the issue of the deliverable still stares us in the face. What exactly would the US expect China to get Kim to deliver? And the US expectations are likely to be in terms of North Korea essentially agreeing to a phased rollback of its nuclear program, which to me seems like something distant and fairly unlikely. Is that your sense also?
Yeah, you're right. It is distant. We cannot say it is not possible at all, but it is distant. As I mentioned before, there is this huge mistrust. So someone has to be a deal broker here. So the US does not trust North Korea. In this case, China can convince, Xi Jinping can convince Kim Jong-un, and then somehow, I don't know what the terms are, but somehow can convince this leader, and then soften the voice, and then US might be like, okay, like China is giving guarantee to North Korea, so they both sides might approach to the table with something tangible, because right now they are making promises and promises, but who is going to take the first step?
Okay, let me broaden the picture a little. So South Korea yes, South Korea has US troops stationed there, and that's a Chinese concern. But China also has a very flourishing trade with South Korea. In fact, it's the fourth largest trade partner. So let me pull in Japan here. In terms of geopolitical stability, Japan is another entity where North Korea is useful to China. Would you agree with me?
Right, right. Japan has always been trying to in the picture because, like, as you know, in the last couple of months, Kim had meetings with South Korean leader, Chinese leader, with Trump, but Japan is out of the picture right now, and Japan wants to play a key role here, both to have allies in the region because since Trump became a president, the U.S.-Japan relations are not in their best terms. So Japan is trying to make peace with the countries in the region like China and South Korea. But at the same time, we have to keep this in mind, like there is a long-term issues going on between those countries. So it is a win-win for any country in the region, and especially for Japan too. But Japan is somehow excluded from all these meetings, all these negotiations, all these deals, and yes, that Japan should be part of these too.
So when do you expect a likely second summit? Or you think Kim and Xi Jinping were actually discussing this when Kim was in Beijing?
Actually, yes, I'm expecting this meeting to happen very soon. That's why Kim Jong-un went to China. That is the main motivation here. It is just not a random visit in a random time. He went to China to do something. Obviously, the motivation is about the U.S., his meeting with the U.S. And I believe there was an explanation a couple of days ago that this meeting between the U.S. and North Korea is not in too distant future. So they are giving the signals right now, and this meeting assures us that the meeting is going to be held soon, very soon.
Okay, thank you so much, Omer Kanan, giving us your view on Kim's Beijing visit and the US-China, North Korea triangle, which is, of course, very interesting and also extremely complex. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.